Center for the Humanities in an Urban Environment, and it is a great pleasure to be able to introduce our speaker tonight. Before I do, there are several entities that I would like to acknowledge and thank, primarily the Betsy Hotel, which has served as Dr. Stern's host for the past week and has a very vigorous program of visiting scholars, visiting writers program that has really done a great deal to enliven the intellectual and artistic scene in Milwaukee, and it's an important feature. The Betsy has become an important feature of Miami Arts, and we're very grateful for all that they have done. Thank you, Pablo, and of course Deborah and Jonathan as well. I'm very grateful too for the strong cooperation and support that the other partners that I have in the endeavors related to Exile studies in the Beyond Swastika and Jim Crow program at the Coral Gables Museum. The strong support that has come out of the English department and the Exile Studies program headed by Dr. Asher Milbauer. The speaker tonight is particularly appropriate to complement the exhibition at the Coral Gables Museum, which is, as I've said to many of you already, as much a narrative and an evocative presentation as it is anything else. And unlike many museum exhibits, it's not simply a static representation, but it is a kinetic record of artifacts that are meant to produce questions and encourage discussion. So far, we've had a number of very good events. Professor Stern has been working very hard since he's come here last Saturday, participating in a panel discussion at the Coral Gables Museum, screening and commenting on a film called The Ritchie Boys. I'll mention that in some detail, in greater detail in just a moment. And here today, presenting a lecture on the state of exile studies. It's a particularly fitting topic for Dr. Stern to take up, since he is one of the founding scholars in that area, and his work has been a guide to a number of generations of subsequent scholars who have pursued these issues and have greatly benefited from the work that he has done. Professor Stern was born in Germany in 1921 and
make me older than I am.
and left in 1937. The only member of his family able to leave Germany, and the only one to survive the war. In 1943, Dr. Stern joined the Army intelligence, and after training at Camp Ritchie among a group of other former German citizens who had come to America fleeing the Nazis, after training at Camp Ritchie, he returned to Europe with the D-Day invasion and participated in the interrogation of German prisoners of war and the development of intelligence in the last 2 years of fighting in Europe. When he returned to the United States, he resumed studies which he had begun at Columbia before the war, and in 1953 got a PhD in Germanic and in German language and literature. He went on to teach at a number of universities before going to Wayne State University as a distinguished professor, and remained there for the rest of his career, retiring as provost of Wayne State University, and then becoming director of the Institute for the Righteous at the Holy Cross Museum in Farmington, Michigan. Dr. Stern has written dozens of books in both English and in German. He has taught at a number of German universities and has received awards from the German government for his work in exile studies. It is a great privilege to have him here tonight, and I ask you to join me in welcoming him now.
I could listen to that all night.
Go on for quite a bit longer.
And you know, I am addressing present day and future scholars of exile literature. It is something that is comparatively recent as we go to periodization in literature. Actually, the term turns up already in the 1940s, before the end of World War II, and is then goes gliding into the vocabulary. And you may well ask, and then you had proponents to keep it, to popularize it, to make it enter university curricula, as you are now doing under the guidance of these professors who were so welcoming. Thank you also, Professor Milbauer. You may well ask what motivated us to plead for the recognition of a further subdivision in literary periodization beyond such established courses as caesura, as classicism, romanticism, expressionism, neo-romanticism, and so forth and so on, which you will all have to learn if you want to get a degree. So, but I'm kidding you now. There were many incentives. The first impulses really emanated from the exiles themselves. They published anthologies of each other's works, and then so that showed some of the quality of the literature that was likely to be lost. And then there came the first distinguished scholars. One whom I knew was Professor Berenson, who was living in Bromma, Sweden, and he convinced the University of Stockholm to introduce one or two courses on the subject. And there were others of his age and generation. And then we came sort of at the ground level of academic rise, and we liked the idea. So you may well ask, what were the incentives to do so? And I'll give you some of them. But at first, as there is always, not only in academics, if you try a new subject, somebody will come up and say, as a Spanish colleague did, he said, loco completamente, and a scholar in French said, fou complètement, and one in Jewish studies said, meshuggah, I'll translate correctly, and and so on and so on, and but we weren't dissuaded because the incentives were there. So let me pick out, there were many more, and you may want to ask about them, but three stand back in my mind. We felt we had to resurrect the exiled authors of the Nazi period and their works from the oblivion to which their government had condemned them by depriving them not only of their ability to write freely, but of the bulk of their readership. You know, resonance, reception theory tells you is so important in bringing about the success or failure of an author. Secondly, we agreed with their message, simply put, of fighting oppression and dehumanization by championing an enlightened humanism. Berenson called it the humanistic front. It's a little bit facile, but it encapsulates something within the desire to do exile studies. And then there's a personal, and I think one of the guiding lights for students and graduate students is that follow your dream. If you like a subject, that's what will carry you through the shoals of exams and other nasty institutional introductions. But yes, we realized that so many young exiles were speaking for all of us when they reminded us that the state of exile was a recurring occurrence of the human experience, an archetypal experience, experiential, a condition of the, as so many argued, that we were living in that 20th century as living in the century of exile. So we could say, yes, we can profit from a message that so many, older than us, more experienced, more eloquent, had put before us after they, like us, had gone through the cauldron of banishment and flight. It is hardly necessary to add that the 21st century has brought no abatement. As you will notice, future scholars will have to deal not only with their own experiments, their own experiences, and their own inventiveness and creativity, but I have to admit, to deal with some of the messes we left for you after we have passed from the scene. But that is something that also governments do for future generations. So, having said, you called me one of the pioneers of exile studies, thank you. To turn more modest for a moment, I should say that we also were privileged to be among the pioneers, these authors, these fine scholars, our seniors, the pioneers of exile studies. When it started, we were not the very first ones to advocate its pursuit. And so the exiles deserve the credit, and as I was trying to point out. But as I now probably will leave the scene one of these days, I'm not ready to concede yet, but I wish I could be starting out with you. Let me invoke the past to foresee the future. As all scholars faced with new horizons in scholarship, we started out after World War II with necessary delimitations and definitions. We defined exile, for example, we argued about such tangential subjects as home, leaving home, asylum, escape, and various terminology that surrounds the exile experience. As to the former, we defined exile as follows in one of the early writings. It is a forcibly imposed flight or expulsion from one's own home country by a tyrannical ruler or government. It's very simple, easy to understand, and in retrospect, tomorrow's scholars will look at various countries and see that we have to correct ourselves. The definition was fine, and it applies to many strata and states, but also, aren't we sure today, don't we see it all around us, that not only governments and rulers impel flights from one's homes. We also stressed, though not invariably, the bleakness of the exile experience, allowing too little space for the wide-ranging individual reaction to their outcast stage. For example, I began one of my articles of that early time with a quote from the Aeneid. New refugees in a great crowd, men and women gathered for exile, young, pitiful people, coming from every quarter, minds made up with their belongings for whatever lands would lead them to by sea. Good, it's poetic, but we have to reach out for broader definitions for making elasticity possible, especially as you here at FIU want to explore exile on a comparative basis in many countries of many periods. Let me invoke here an observation by the colleague who invited me here to sunny Florida, not today, Professor Asher Siebelsbauer. He made a basic and profound observation about the status of exile, which I'm convinced will continue to be applicable when tested in later times across time and nations. He said, in essence, exile is a style of life which no outsider can ever fully comprehend. But let me add that we, as fellow exiles, also weren't clairvoyant. An example may illustrate this point out of my experience you were kind enough to mention during the war. My friend and comrade in arms, the author Karl Frucht, had a last reunion with me a few months before his death. We were two exiles. Perhaps sensing that this might be our last meeting, we tried to arrive at a balance sheet of our uprooted lives. Karl quoted from his autobiography. The drama of our lives, he wrote, is cruel and played with a stacked desk, which each of us is bound to lose. I, with a somewhat parallel life, answered with an optimistic quote by the classical author Schiller, even confronted with the grave, we plant a tree of hope. Neither philosophy, if such it can be called, can be applied, as some interpreters have done, to the exile experience in general. If two such exiles as Karl and me, with analogous backgrounds, could differ so extensively, what will future exile scholarship find in comparing the exile and Nobel Prize winner from Nigeria, Wole Soyinka, with Alexander Solzhenitsyn, exiled from the Soviet Union in 1974, or with Milan Kundera from Czechoslovakia 1 year later. Parenthetically, when I met Soyinka at my home university, he gave the inaugural address, as a footnote, during the installation of our then new president. I asked him about his exile status. He said, "I'm not an exile. I write beyond borders." So the exiles themselves make trouble for us. Perhaps here's a bit of self-criticism is in order. I recently had occasion to reread some of my past articles and lectures. Well, I could draw some conclusions about my attitudes at the time. I saw myself firmly rooted in my religion and my German and European cultural heritage. I saw the world divided by nations and perceived their culture as homogeneous. But that ain't necessarily so. We live in a post-colonial world, and in a post-colonial period of writing about that world. Some of our colleagues refer to that world as hybrid rather than homogeneous. So when we speak of exiles, we certainly can still apply the old definition, but only selectively. Yes, it is the forcible imposed flight or expulsion from one's own home country by a tyrannical ruler or government. That definition applies surely to Ovid's expulsion from Rome, to the exiles from Nazi Germany, and from some countries from Africa and South America. But several exile scholars, including myself, now believe that the definition needs expansion. Is governmental terror really the only cause which causes men and women to leave their native soil? Isn't it possible that a powerful group within a hybrid society can exert the same type of pressure? Let us for a moment hypothesize, wrongly I hope, that the Crimean Peninsula will be separated from the Ukraine and becomes either in the protectorate of the Soviet Union. Someone now living in that small peninsula is becoming overnight an exile. Let's say a Ukrainian patriot is becoming an exile in his or her own country. What should have brought me to that conclusion much earlier is my encounter with the eminent, award-winning Afro-American writer James Baldwin. As a vice president at Wayne State University, I had nominated him for an honorary doctorate. We met to discuss details. When I told him, in response to one of his questions, that one of my specialties was exile studies, he said, "Well, I'm an exile." I countered, rather smart alecky, "Well, not by our scholarly standards, Mr. Baldwin. We would refer to you as an expatriate." "That's not how I see it," he answered. "When I left America for Paris, I emigrated because the prejudice and ill will all around me deprived me of my creativity." That should have alerted me to other examples throughout history, when psychological pressure suggested flight. When Emile Zola was scorned for defending Dreyfus, he left France. Or most recently, the German Jewish writer Arno Reinfrank, hidden during the Holocaust in Germany, emigrated to England after the restoration of democratic rule in Germany and wrote a poem stating his reasons, which reflect the pressure from within rather than from without. And in this poem, which he wrote after visiting a resurrected synagogue, goes like this: "The white mortar is too new, the wooden benches far too freshly polished, that when I enter I can't help, that my very soul congeals to ice." Is he an exile? He doesn't have to leave because of a democratic government in Germany. Of course, the late discovery of further literary works written in exile may also cause re-examination of our definitions. Around the turn of the century, an Austrian colleague and librarian, Ursula Seber, discovered the full text of a novel by the Polish-born German-Jewish writer Salomon Dembitzer called Visa to America. He had reached our shores via a tortuous route, fleeing from Germany to Belgium, to France, to Spain, to Portugal, finally arriving here. Well, a confirmed socialist, if not a communist, he frankly did not like it in this country and was able to continue his flight to Australia. I leave it to others to decide whether his second junket should make him, by a new definition, a double exile. You see some of the mess we are leaving you. But I have no doubt about a further supplementary definition which has been kicked around for a long time. Right from the beginning of exile studies, some scholars argued that some writers and artists ostracized by the Nazis should be included in our studies, even if they remained in Germany. The label we gave that inner withdrawal was inner emigration. I'll give you an example of one author to whom I would not deny it, but again, I leave judgments to the future. There was a writer by the name of Hans Fallada, F-A-L-L-A-D-A, who was opposed to the Nazis. They did not because he was of good Aryan stock. They didn't put him in a concentration camp, but they did put him in jail. And so he could write his diary in jail. And he's not Jewish, of course. He writes, and each evening he has to give this new entry to a censor. And then he gets it back in the morning, nothing objectionable in those lines, and then that goes on for 2 years. When he is released from prison after the cessation of Nazi rule, two women scholars of German origin in England said they wanted to look at that diary. Something didn't seem right, because it was, in general, a rubber stamp, approval and disapproval, griping about prison and all that, nothing really, truly objectionable. And so they looked at those pages with a microscope. And lo and behold, interlinearly, underneath each line, in microscopic script, was a diary entry of that same day written in oppositional terms to his regime. And these two scholars, I would submit, will not have to look for promotion again. It caused a stir. This is the kind of discovery that Michael and Usher dream about, and I did at one time too. That you really, it's a sensation if you find something like that. And so subsequently, the diary in full view of the censor was published as well. No, I would say Hans Fallada was an inner exile. I would give him that recognition. And another German author who also wrote many stories for children, one of them for a couple of years ago, even made a film in the United States. It was called, what was it called? Parent Trouble. Did any of you see it? It's about twin girls. You saw it. And you want to say something? Okay. He wrote children's books, but he also he was not able to oppose. So he writes on May 10th, 1933, when the funeral pyres for books went up in all German university towns, not only Berlin, he said, I stood there with my clenched fist in my pocket. But I would say, what else could he have done? So the German critic, Reich Ranitzky, gave him the title of Exile honoris causa. So that also happened. To be sure, some scholars, upon re-examination, have rejected the term inner immigration. But what else would you call people who were they could opposed? Again, final decisions are to be made. Now, as a compensation for you following us, you have challenges which we have ignored. There are sources open to future researchers which we have not fully taken advantage of in the past. We had a certain shyness of going to a literary work as, for example, exemplified by the Chilean author Isabel Allende, or by a later creative writer, also a Nobel Prize recipient, Herta Müller. They added insights which, even though you may study the history, really infinitely adds to our knowledge of the background, of the achievements of these exiles who were able to grasp reality and bring it together with fiction. For example, Herta Müller wrote a short story before she fled the German Democratic Republic. She encapsulates, as I have rarely seen done, the whole trauma of ostracism. I should incidentally say that one of the dreams of this year was to bring Herta Müller, the Nobel Prize winner, to this campus, and it only went wrong because Herta Müller is seriously ill, and I wish to congratulate you on your enterprise to bring a Nobel Prize winner to what is so absolutely à la page in bringing a creative writer of exile literature to your campus. May happen some other year. But what she does goes beyond the mission of a historian. There's one scene in a story by her before she fled the GDR, in which the whole trauma of ostracism is indeed encapsulated. The narrator sits on the stoop of a staircase, having fled from being cold-shouldered by her fellow workers who, in truth or by hypocrisy, are very loyal communists. That disappeared after the fall of the wall. And now I know that we must not necessarily, it's a cautionary note for literary students, that we do not equate protagonist and author. But where an author, as Herta Müller, is crying out out of a situation in extremis. Such exile, it would be equally wrong to seal off experience and fiction from one another. Ladies and gentlemen, I have been asked by my good sponsors to try to map the tasks that await the future toilers in the field of exile studies, such as you, friends and colleagues and students at FIU. I'm, of course, no prophet, and everything I say may be erased by events. There are several other terms which undoubtedly will come under, I hope not microscope, not everything is written in small script, but that will come to your attention. Especially as you go global, our definitions, I fear, were largely Eurocentric and or by countries influenced by European cultures. But there are terms which are inevitably linked to exile, as I said in opening. For example, home. What does home mean? Oh, the German word Heimat is even more honeycombed with emotion than the English word. I've sampled dozens of literary works and found this concept is so charged with connotative meanings, with subjective interpretations, emotional overtures, local specificity, that one should simply, I would say, leave it alone, but we won't. One should simply perhaps leave the definition to each who has lost his or her home because of adverse forces. Let me dramatize the difference for a moment. The French-born author, Adalbert Chamisso, who wrote in German, he, persecuted by the French Revolution, dreams of Castle Boncourt, where he was born, but which was torn down long ago. His enlightened predecessor, Voltaire, exiled several times, argues that patriotism should transcend love of one's own country. It should extend beyond. For the German poet Walter Mehring, home is the city of Berlin, where his dialect is spoken, while some of his German contemporaries fighting against the fascist forces in the Spanish Civil War composed a song proclaiming that the environs of Madrid are their new home. Other writers are full of ambivalences. The German Jewish essayist Jean Amery, talking on the subject of Heimat, contradicts himself several times, and he didn't like it when I wrote that. It is not good, he wrote, not to have a home, and he paraphrases a poem by Nietzsche with the plaint, "Woe to him who has no home." But a few paragraphs later, he lists a whole panoply of surrogates for home, be they religion, clinging to material goods, fame, honors, or ideologies. As to the first, religion, the German Jewish author Else Lasker-Schüler argues that the real home of a Jew is the Torah. On a pragmatic basis, the eloquent German poet Karl Wolfskehl is even more contradictory. He writes a renunciation of his German homeland in a letter to a friend in Germany, but then begs his niece to extract him from his miserable foreign land of asylum, New Zealand, and to take him home. Within letter written within 2 weeks of one another. Inevitably, these divergencies and ambivalences continued even after the return of the exiles to their home country. The novelist Friedrich Thorberg reintegrated all but completely into the life of his native Austrian. His fellow romancier, Alfred Döblin, decided to leave Europe after his return, this time voluntarily. There are these contradictions. The German poet Hilde Domin, who friend and who died last year, while clearly seeing the flaws of her new Germany, declared in one of her poems that dawn is rising for a second time, an optimistic observation. I'll give you the counterpart. They knew each other quite well. There's a German writer living in Berlin. He's also the president of our pen club in Exile, as we were formerly called, and he wrote a short story. Fascinating. A man knowing that he has to flee his home in Berlin, goes to his street and rolls it up like a carpet, a bit surrealistic, and carries the carpet underneath his arm into his exile. After the war, he returns to Berlin and unrolls the carpet in his street, and lo and behold, it doesn't fit. And he goes around the city and tries it in many other parts of town, and it fits nowhere. I will not explain anything. You're on the way to becoming your own literary interpreters, but you got this point. Another scholar, and a scholar now, entitled his essay, Heimat, but where is it? These different opinions might still occupy our successors working at this new center. I will also, if briefly, call attention to another still unresolved difference of opinion in exile studies, which concerns the length of exile. When does it end? I do so because it particularly points to Florida as a possible analog. Some scholars argue that a person's exile ends, exile ends when he or she has integrated into the culture and nota bene the language of his country of asylum. For example, there's a German author living in Peru, and his German name was Paul Engel, but Diego Viga also. So he writes, he's also a physician, so he writes his scholarly work as Paul Engel in German, also anything concerning his home country in German. But he writes wonderful gaucho stories, and that is under Diego Viga, and I'm sure a good part of his Peruvian readers have no idea that Paul Engel is hiding under Diego Viga. Others retort, exile ends only after the last exile has either returned home or died. Still others contend the exile status transfers to the next 2 generations, but not beyond. So I became curious and asked myself whether any Hispanic scholars specializing in the exiles from Castro's Cuba might have an answer. I quote from that scholarly article. becoming American takes different forms, has different meanings, and is reached by different paths. But the process is one in which all children of immigrants and refugees are inexorably engaged, forming a new national self and defining an identity for themselves, which is to say, a meaningful place in the society that is now home to them. In the latest survey, I quote on, we asked them which place felt most like home. The United States, their or their parents' or grandparents' homeland, both or neither. The overwhelming majority of the Cuban third generation of children of immigrants and refugees, 9 out of 10 said that the United States was home. Perhaps this survey may apply to other successor generations as well, though Florida's Cuban group is special. Many live in a concentrated group and form a culturally close-knit home community, giving the exiles a sense of belongingness in their country of asylum. But here too, there may be an all-exclusive answer. We might just let the matter rest with the divergences intact. We would be following the advice of a renowned exile scholar, writer, and psychoanalyst, and he writes, the concept home is, according to my experience, a necessarily individual experience. But perhaps the Cuban findings render a bifurcated answer depending on the life in the asylum country. In short, we have vainly struggled to come to a common denominator, but we can see by the definition that these two Cuban writers, Rimbaud and Rimbaud, have staked out, that there may be a bifurcation. How you live, how the country of asylum places you, or you place yourself, and thereby define home in a way for you. So I said, here's some of the questions that we left open for you to confuse you totally. But there are, and I spoke of exciting new challenges. There are sources open to the future researchers. Well, you all know this better than I. You turn on your computer and wow, you're inside an archive all of a sudden. But I mean to go beyond the mechanical accessibility. There is, for example, I said already, one way of looking at exile is through the eyes of creative writers. You know, if you read House of Ghosts by Isabel Allende, then you are in her country and her persecuted status. Now, the new areas that have just opened up, they may excite you more than anything else. I'm giving you 4 points. Am I exceeding my time? Okay. An entire wing of Germany's National Library in Frankfurt is devoted to the life and works of the exiles who escaped during Germany's Third Reich. It concentrates in the main on German intellectuals, including writers. Last year, the library's administration decided to expand its focus to art and artists. I mean, there has been work done in the past as well, but they want to make it now also a focal point, just as literature. I would guess that music and musicians will become an additional area of research. I might suggest that we in American exile studies link up with the departments of art and artists in our own colleges and universities, and follow thereby the lead of the German National Library. Again, FIU has made a start in that direction in the direction of music. Professor Joel Gallant is a major collaborator on the 23rd volume edition of the Exile composer Kurt Weill. I should mention that fellow scholars have already done pioneering work in recording the creative works of exile artists and composers and performers, but much remains to be done. Second, the escape of the exiles has often been documented, but much research has to be done on the rescuers, especially in following their persistent, often daring efforts bring this to a wider public. For example, all specialists in our field know the exploits of Varian Fry, sometimes called the American Raoul Wallenberg. Still, he has not become a household work. His mission, of course, as you know, was to bring exiled writers and intellectuals, primarily, not exclusively, from the unoccupied part of France via Marseille to countries of asylum. Now, these people, and I could tell a personal story. I will restrain myself out of inborn modesty. If you brag about modesty, are you still modest? The woman to whom I really owe the pleasure of sitting here in this circle. But here we can, what impels people to become altruists? Now here we must rely on other departments within your complex as you go into the expansive idea of exile. Our colleagues in the sciences and social sciences become thereby very truly important. They too have asked themselves what triggers an altruistic action. I've drawn on their insights when analyzing texts. For example, I could here detail about 5 explanations given at various universities in the United States, ranging from the institute at the in Atlanta, Georgia, attached to the university, and I could end with the well, you might like to ask a question. How do you explain if somebody goes to the house of a neighbor who is threatened and escorts him across a border at the risk of endangering both yourself and your family? And the last explanation, the neuroscientists have gotten into the act, and they have found a very selfish way, a selfish explanation for altruistic actions. You see, they say, if you do a good action, then a shot of oxytocin, a pleasant feeling secretion, is produced when you do a good deed. And they said, that's an explanation. You want to feel good, and you get that when this is released. I'm not a scientist, but my reputed university to the north of me, the University of Michigan, is doing those experiments, and that is all only giving you the tools. When you read a book, there are hints. And I've checked stories like Anna Zager's Transit, where somebody helps someone, the Seventh Cross, where somebody is rescued by good-natured people. What triggers them? And there are hints. What this person, what the author believes, and that is just as important, of course, because they are part of the human equation and give us explanations. So now the final new approach, to my mind, appears to be, or I think so, is what we haven't done much of, some samples. How do the writers of the country of asylum record, or better said, how do they poeticize or fictionalize what they see around them when the exiles come in? And there is a wealth out there because the exiles in their presence have become the starting point for them to write their own works. On a global scale, many of the most prominent authors of various nations wrote poems, dramas, and prose works centering on one exile or a group. In America, Nobel Prize winner Saul Bellow composed two works on the scene, Mr. Samler's Planet and the Bella Rosa Connection. The second work provides an entirely new perspective on the life of an exiled couple obsessed by gratitude to their savior, who never answers them. It's a fascinating book. Numerous American authors have placed well-known exile personalities on stage, such as John Morantz in his award-winning play, Those Old Sad Songs. He ends his drama with a surprise effect. The exile had assumed a fictitious identity because he was afraid. And Bertolt Brecht appears in so many American plays that I was able to weave an entire article about his ubiquitousness. And in a novel of suspense, J. Perini fictionalizes the attempted flight of Walter Benjamin across the Pyrenees and his suicide when refused passage into Spain. As a final example from the US, in Jonathan Safran Foer's novel, Everything is Illuminated, also made into a film, a Jew who has returned to Russia has camouflaged himself as an anti-Semite in order not to stick out in a hostile environment. In India, the award-winning writer Anita Desai traces the trying life of a fictitious exile in her novel Mr. Baumgartner's Bombay. In Canada, Anne Michaels came out with a stunning poetic novel, Fugitive Pieces, in which the rescue of a young Polish boy by a Greek archaeologist forms the novel's point of departure. The Argentinian author, Marcos Sobolewski, delves into the tragic descent and demise of an Austrian Jewish immigrant in his novel Las Aguas de Mare. That's just the beginning of a list. But to end this point on a humorous note, one American author, George Baxt, known for his detective novels, produces a thriller, a term used advisedly, entitled The Marlene Dietrich Murder Case. The high or low point of the novel is reached with a catalog-like analysis of the heroine's bodily endowments. adding to this little explored addendum to exile literature by non-exiles is a penchant of filmmakers to accord a role, even a leading role, to exile characters. They range from film adaptations of the works mentioned, for example, of Anne Michael's novel, to works adapted from the text of exiles themselves, for example, the film Nowhere in Africa, based on the autobiography of Stefanie Zweig, to original films that, such as Republic Pictures, you already see the emblem, Three Faces West, in which an American folk hero becomes the protector of a young Austrian woman exile. It will not surprise you that the folksy American hero is played by none other than John Wayne. On a more serious note, in exploring this rather new subfield of exile studies, the film department could join in a common quest. Therefore, an Exile Center, as now established at FIU, can gather evidence on exile from many sources and from many countries and draw on new insights gained by other fields. And I see, lastly, another challenge facing my colleagues at FIU and elsewhere. As you launch on the investigation of exile across countries and ages, will you find that the successive generations of exiles, or even contemporaries, it goes right into the literature, or even contemporaries of one another have borrowed from each other? That the same, that, let us say, there is, the very first German exposure to exiles is right after the French Revolution, when Goethe writes his epic Hermann and Dorothea. And so has somebody ever drawn on Hermann and Dorothea for his or her own exposition on exile? Well, there are some scenes in exile literature, and I'm carrying coals to Newcastle, or I made up a new metaphor, which repeat themselves through the ages. By the waters of Babylon, we sat and cried. We hear in the Babylonian Psalms. But those are tears shed by exiles from continent to continent, as they bemoan their lost homeland. Ovid curses his enemies in unmistakable terms. Did Bertolt Brecht, whose only good grades in the German high school were in classical history, borrow from Goethe? And I just made a discovery here while ensconced in the Betsy Hotel. The father of the owners, as Heimat Plotzig, begins a poem with a diatribe against T.S. Eliot for his anti-Semitic lyric, Bleistein with a cigar. But he joins, despite his dislike and loathing for an anti-Semitic poem, he draws back and says, aren't we all exiles? And he says to his adversary in writing, bow down to them and let us weep for our exile from Babylon to Miami. Last and most important, bridging time periods and locales will challenge future students of exile in numerous and unforeseeable ways. It will require further language studies, skills, an appreciation of cultural differences. It's mind-opening, a working acquaintance with allied fields, and, I bet you, unending curiosities. Hats off to FIU for becoming guides on a future path. A somewhat older colleague, and you are beholding him, can cheer you on with the Spanish adage, manos a la obra. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Stern, for that marvelous presentation. I'm sure a number of you have questions that you'd like to raise. Before doing that, I just want to mention the continuing discussion on Exile that will go on Monday at the Mark Pavilion when Professor Donald Hoonigan will talk at 7 p.m. on the academic experience of Exile. So we've had our appetites whetted very well here tonight. Monday, the discussion will continue. But for now, let me ask if you have any questions that you'd like to pose to Dr. Stern.
Yes.
Actually, my question is on one of the...
Would you field the question? Pass them on. I have a bit of.
Stephanie, please.
Yeah, I'm sorry. My question is very simple, actually. The story that you mentioned about the exile rolling up the street and taking it with him, who was the author of that story?
Yes. Would you repeat it for the audience?
Stephanie was asking about the author of the short story who wrote about actually rolling up a street in Berlin, taking it away, returning after the war, and being unable to find a place anywhere for that street.
And you would. What is your interpretation of that?
Well, I mean, my interpretation is that the protagonist is taking all of his feelings, all of his patriotism, everything that he could back to.
Yes.
In the United States, but couldn't find a place for himself because he was carrying all the baggage
Good.
of his homeland to the United States with him. But my question is who is the author of that story?
The author is Günther, G-U umlaut, with those two dots, N-T-E-R, Kunert, K-U-N-E-R-T. And of course, I would say it's also it's a poetically phrased way of saying what Wolf said, you can't go home again. Yes, sir.
I was wondering if you mentioned that some scholars say that exile status transferred to the next two generations, but not beyond.
Thank you.
I was just wondering, that's very specific.
Please.
And I think that's an interesting point. Do you agree that the exilic status, the exilic condition will terminate after the second generation, or do you feel differently?
My own interpretation, and I have revised my own feelings on many points as I wandered through the decades. My own interpretation is twofold. When the language of the asylum becomes the literary language of the author, and he handles it. You mentioned wait a minute, was it you or was it our colleague who said he is treating one of the standard authors? But my interpretation is when are you teaching Joseph Conrad?
Yes.
Yes, you were. You were the one. When you mentioned we had dinner together, but we don't endorse anybody here. When we had dinner together, you said you treated Joseph Conrad, and I haven't heard your lecture, but I would venture to say that you thought it was a marvelous example. You may differ of adjusting to a different culture and masterfully going into English. I would say Joseph Conrad's status as an author ends when his Polish language ability, his Polish writing, gives way to the mastery of English. And there are several who were able to adjust to such an extent that they become, in fact, American or English or Peruvian authors. That's what I say. Okay, you have, I'm quoting Thomas Wolfe again, he says, I've beaten out my exile. They have. Yeah. Oh, yes, sir.
Would you consider yourself to still be in exile? And if not, when did it end for you?
When did
What's that?
does the term, the label exile, do you still apply, do you apply the term exile to?
You mean have we got a label for people who...
Well, do you see yourself as an exile? And if not, why not?
Well, I'm not a creative writer. I leave that to my wife. So, but I'm writing, well, what's mildly creative now is I'm writing my autobiography. I've written a few short stories. They have even been published for the price of $40. And but I do that only to compete with my wife. But I think, having worn the uniform of this country, which is an indelible way of becoming what you are now, among other things. Having gone to an American high school, an American college, I still have an accent that won't disappear. But when I was at basic training, I also learned how to talk like a Texan. So, yeah, I consider myself an American.
Yes, Hannah.
Okay, my students, I'm a high school teacher, and my students just completed a project on exile, and they researched exiles around the world. And a couple of them chose people who have been, they argued that were exiled from professions, such as sports. And then a couple of them also chose individuals who were deported back to their home country from the United States, because they were in the United States illegally. Do you think that those two examples are examples of exiles? And how would you respond to my students?
Thank you. I'm a little bit hard of hearing, so.
And I think it's a wonderful issue that we've actually been talking about in class. Who has the right to determine the status of exile? Can a person simply say, I feel like an exile? And does that make that individual an exile? Or are there objective criteria which must be fulfilled first?
I think one of the objective criteria, again, is language. And another one is affinity for where you feel you belong. And that goes beyond language. Some people who have gone, I met the father of a new acquaintances. He has an exile, he has an accent, but he wore also the uniform. He is, I think, even if tomorrow Cuba Libre were to be told that everybody could go there without persecution, I think he would still say, I have established my home in Coral Gables, and that's where I belong. And yes, it is. That's why I brought up this whole 2 pages and ran overtime because of it, of home. That's so hard because people differ so widely. And if you now go into other countries, if your home is a hovel in in Pretorius, Africa, is that home? No. You were trying to do daring things to get away, not only from persecution, but from those dismal surroundings you live in. So affinity is another one, and I think you will have, I like the idea that this Cuban scholar did in the bifurcation. You know, on the one hand this, on the one hand that. If you go this road or this road, you can make 2 definitions of where you belong. I mean, each one in his own case. But the criteria are clearly laid out in this article by a expert on Cuban immigration.
Any other questions? Frank?
Just building off Hannah's question, to me it seems like an additional challenge for future students studying exile.
Yes.
Would be sort of, on one hand, we want broader definitions and more complex definitions of exile.
Yes.
But we intuitively don't want to be so broad that it demeans the exilic experience. So sometimes I wonder how we can negotiate that. And in a way, that's why I really like that you brought up this bibliography of works dealing with exile, but sort of from the host country or a non-exile point of view, sort of how they perceive the exilic experience. And that's interesting because I've had questions for Dr. Gillespie about, can we do exilic readings of non-exiles? And in a way, I think so.
Yes.
Without demeaning anything. But I think that was just sort of
I don't want to miss that.
That's an important question, that concept of how does exile studies evolve and continue to explore new areas without losing the essence of exile studies, without diluting the
Very good.
concern.
Very good. Yes, sure. We can broaden a definition to such an extent that it becomes meaningless. If we as literary scholars have a good handle on that, and that is quality. If you see a potboiler like this fellow Baxt dwelling on Marlene Dietrich's admittedly great personality, then you wouldn't say this is, I've read it, you know, because I just thought it would be a good rounding out of a discussion. But it has to have a certain standard. When Anne Michaels writes this novel, Fugitive Pieces, it is so darn good. There is the protagonist, this young Polish boy, grows up under the stewardship of second father. His family is destroyed in a pogrom, and he grows up and he marries, and he seems to be a happy marriage, but he cannot let go of that experience of fleeing through the night to get out of the parental home that is being invaded. And that pursues him. So the marriage, because he cannot jump over his own, he can't jump over his own skin. He becomes a detriment to this marital relations. So it could be a good marriage. And then he meets someone who intuits what he goes through, that what goes haunt him, And that she got so acutely right, because I, as an official at our Holocaust Museum, hear those stories, and and Anne Michaels is so on target that I say, yes, take that source. She'll tell you something. On the other hand, Baxt will tell you stuff that you already know.
This has been a marvelous discussion, and I think it would be selfish to impose too much longer on Dr. Stern. Let me ask for one more question, and then we'll end the evening. Sir Eduardo?
Thank you very much for the presentation. During your discussion, your lecture, you used the term inner exile, and I failed to comprehend whether you mean someone within a country who has not been expelled from the country, but feels alienated from the nationality, the sentiments of the country itself. If that's what you mean by inner exile, or do you mean an internal exilic experience, as if to say mental or intellectual aside? So I don't know which of the two, or if you meant both.
Well, that's a subtle difference. Where are the boundaries of an inner exile?
Yes. Let me say from the beginning, the label of inner exile was quickly appropriated by good Nazis who said that inside they felt always against the regime. You can imagine that. But on the legitimate side, immediately after the fall of the Nazis, we called it Schubladenliteratur, meaning books, book-length manuscripts, poems, and so forth, hidden in desk drawers or wherever, and they came out immediately. And since they take, as you know, years in the making, if that book stands there, is now published, and shows the intention of a opposition, then I would grant that label inner immigration. But I would also extend it to some very courageous youngsters who wrote jazz songs. You know, jazz was forbidden as deranged or deranged compositions, and so if these kids in Cologne, for example, put in their cellars, put on oppositional songs against the Nazis, yes, I'd say, damn right, you belong into that circle of inner immigration. But the opportunist, of course not. And when there is no proof at all, I would say don't arrogate to yourself titles to which you have no proof of belonging.
Thank you very much, and thank you, Dr. Stern.